Okay, so let's discuss the next reading. So first we're going to start off talking about autonomy and authority. And there are some things to look out for, and there's been some psychology studies that can provide us with kinds of warnings and a kind of a look into human nature and mistakes that we might make ourselves. So there's a psychologist, Stanley Milgram, who ran a variety of experiments showing that we should watch out for being complacent and merely following orders. So one of the reasons why he ran a certain series of experiments was he wanted to see how it could be the case that in Nazi Germany there were highly educated, seemingly normal, everyday, good people. How could they kind of give in to the Nazi regime and give in to genocide? So Milgram ran some experiments where he had subjects, and one subject was behind a counter. It was a shock counter where there are increasing degrees of shock that the person behind the counter could give to someone who's sitting in a chair. So there are just increasing degrees of buttons they could push that would administer a shock. And in the chair was supposedly another subject who would have to answer questions, and anytime they missed a question, the scientist would ask the person behind the shock counter to administer a shock. However, what was really going on in the shock experiments was that the person in the chair was really an actor and was kind of in on it. They weren't a real test subject. And so what would happen was eventually the person sitting in the chair, the actor or confederate, would miss questions, and then the real subject who was behind the shock counter would have to administer a shock. And at first they would be light shocks, but there were 30 different degrees of shocks with increasing levels of intensity of the shocks, and where the final button was marked as triple X. And as the subject in the chair kept missing answers to the questions, the person behind the counter would have to keep administering greater degrees of shock. And sometimes the person behind the counter would not want to go any further because the actor in the chair was yelling and screaming. And they could even be yelling and screaming, stop this, I want out of this, I want to get out of this experiment, stop shocking me. But what would happen is the scientist would then ask the person behind the counter to please continue and administer the shock. And in most cases, people would still continue to administer the shock. And even when the actor pretended to be passed out in the chair and was unresponsive, the person behind the counter would administer the shock. And most people went all the way up through triple X, the highest degree of shock. So what these experiments show is something about human nature, that for most people, we generally will give in to orders from an authority figure, such as from a boss, right, or a manager. You might think to yourself, I'm not that person, right? If someone tells me to do something really bad, I wouldn't do that. But given the data, more likely the case is that you are that person. So this can be very telling, but of course, being aware of these Milgram experiments and being aware of kind of our human nature, that can help as far as deterring us from giving in to authority when authority figures tell us to do something that's unethical. Also, it's important for engineers to look out when they're at work, or when their boss or their manager tells them to do something that could be unethical. It's kind of part of human nature to want to just kind of give in and do what an authority figure tells you to do. But at times, engineers need to take a stand and do what's right. So also, being in a hierarchical structure can make one complacent about looking out for possible harms. So just the mere fact that one is in, let's say, a large corporation where there are different hierarchies, there's, let's say, engineers, entry-level management, middle management, vice president, higher level management positions, and then we have CEOs and the like. Just being in this hierarchical structure, this can also have a psychological effect of making one be complacent about looking out for possible harms, because you think, oh, there's someone else who's looking out for it, right? There's someone else higher above me. It's their responsibility, not my responsibility. I might be working on a project. I might be working on a team that's assigned to one part of the project, and I shouldn't look out for what different teams are doing on this same project. Different teams are working on different aspects of this project, but I'm not going to look out for it. That's really the manager's job. It's not my job. So it's very easy to get into this kind of complacency where people stop looking out for possible harms, given that one finds oneself in a hierarchical structure or system. However, even if one is in such a system, one still has an obligation to remain vigilant, and one is at least partially responsible in most cases if one is not. So one still has an obligation to investigate. It could just be asking simple questions of, let's say, members of a different team that are working on a different part of one's project, or investigating and just asking a simple question like, how are things going on your side of things? Or it could be asking questions about maybe fellow team members where you might have some indication that maybe there's something wrong going on, to investigate further into it and not just think, oh, that's my manager's job. I'm not going to worry about it. And if you, let's say, don't investigate and you don't remain vigilant, let's say for something that is on your own project that maybe your team is just being a part of, let's say if you're an engineer, then you are still responsible. You have a partial degree of responsibility or blame or guilt for, let's say, if there's something bad that ends up coming about for the product itself. Let's say the product harms other people or harms the environment, what have you. You are in part responsible even though you didn't do it yourself, because you have an obligation to investigate other teams and other people who are working on your same project to make sure that things are going well. All right, so next let's talk about this other kind of phenomena, this psychological phenomenon called groupthink. And this is where engineers are more likely to, so first let me just say that engineers are more likely to work in groups rather than individually. So in working in groups, there's this psychological phenomena called groupthink, which is something to look out for. And this is where groups come to agreement, right? Groups tend to come to agreement at the expense of critical thinking, at the expense of reflection and critical thought as far as whether or not there might be a problem going on, or they might be making a product that is in some way unethical. And groupthink, this phenomena, is a common problem in the history of NASA. So here are some parts of groupthink. Here's kind of what's going on with this psychological phenomena. And this is where in groupthink, people in the group have an illusion of invulnerability. They think they're invulnerable, that they can do no wrong. So there's an illusion of invulnerability of the group to failure. So when people are kind of in a gang together, they kind of have a greater sense of invulnerability. There also tends to be a rationalization that shifts responsibility to non-members. So people in the group, they tend to rationalize that if there are any problems or there's any blame to be given out for a problem in the project, it's really someone else's fault, someone who's not a member of our group or our team. There's also an assumption of the inherent moral goodness of the group at the cost of critical reflection. So there's a tendency for people to think, when working in groups, to think that their group is good and their group is morally good and ethical. And this can just be a kind of false pretense because having this kind of thought or this kind of facade that our group is morally good could make members of the group not think critically, not think ethically about possible solutions, not use one's moral imaginations to think about possible ramifications that a product or a decision might have on society at large. And here are some more component parts of groupthink. For D, there's individual self-censorship, not to rock the boat of the group. So when people work in groups, it tends to be the case that individuals are less likely to raise a criticism or objection or dissent. They kind of censor themselves from speaking up because they don't want to rock the boat of the group. They want everything to be unified in the group. There's also an illusion of unanimity where people tend to think that, oh, everyone's on board. We're all working together. We're all part of the same team. We all agree. Where even silence of a member, when an issue comes out and there are some members who are silent, and they might have questionable looks on their face, but they're silent, that just generally can be interpreted by members of a group as being consent. And they think, oh yeah, he's on board, he didn't say anything, or she's on board because she didn't say anything, and they kind of just take it for granted. So there is this tendency for this to occur. Also, there's direct pressure, usually by the group leader, on members who disagree. So there's, for those who do disagree, group leaders tend to put pressure on those people who disagree to kind of get in line and to stop raising disagreement. And this pressure is used in order to try to keep the group unified. So we are social animals, and we do like social contact and working together in teams. And so these kinds of psychological biases of groupthink can kind of work their way in when we're working together in groups. There's also mind guarding the group from outside dissenting views by not allowing for their introduction. So people working together in group, there might be some criticisms from the outside. The group might not even entertain those objections, right? Because there's a kind of mind guarding phenomena where people in groups tend to not even entertain dissent and want to try to guard or shield themselves from any kind of dissent. All right, so this is a psychological phenomenon that definitely should be looked out for, but how can we try to combat groupthink? Well, managers need to be aware of it and take constructive steps to resist it. So as with the Milgram experiments, knowing about the Milgram experiments, knowing about groupthink can itself lead to possible awareness and to possible solutions of trying to combat groupthink. And an important step needs to be taken by managers. For example, managers and leaders of a company need to try to instill a culture where dissent is encouraged and is not frowned upon. And it can even be the case that managers even should be required to present dissenting opinions, right? Just to start things off, managers can just think of it as kind of like brainstorming, right? Brainstorming dissent and possible weaknesses of, let's say, a project or of a product, and managers can even take part, and that itself, people in leadership positions, a lot of times consciously or subconsciously, people look up to them as kind of role models and guides for action. So seeing a manager raise dissent and take part in this kind of exercise of possible weaknesses of a project or possible unethical implications of a project, this itself can help create the right kind of culture where dissenting voices are more likely to arise and people are more likely to speak up about it. Okay, so let's discuss next a different study by Robert Jackall. And Jackall ran this study on managers and looking at kind of what might be typical kind of corporate environmental culture. And not all corporations are like this, but what Jackall found is that in most corporate settings, kind of hierarchical corporate settings, managers largely don't take into account moral considerations, but only monetary or practical considerations. So instead of, for example, saying we shouldn't create a harmful product because that would kill other people, let's say, or make them very sick, and that's just wrong, they tend to think this way along more monetary and practical ways of thinking. They tend to think, well, we shouldn't create a harmful product because it will hurt our public image, and then we might lose money, right, because we've hurt our public image. So managers tend to think along these lines. Not all of them do, but generally what Robert Jackall's study found was that most do. And also the study found that mostly or generally when managers get caught doing something unethical, they pass the blame onto subordinate fall guys. So those who are under the managers tend to try to deflect the blame and responsibility onto people that work for them. So if there's a manager who's a manager of engineers, it tends to be the case that managers will try to deflect the blame onto an engineer that's working underneath them. And also managers tend to believe that subordinates, let's say engineers that are working underneath them, should mindlessly follow orders and be a team player, right? Don't raise dissent, don't raise your criticism, just keep your head down and just keep working at all costs, even if it leads to creating a product that harms others, or to cars that, for example, catch on fire and explode when rear-ended by another car at moderate speeds, things like that. Managers expect those who work underneath them to fall in line and keep their head down. So these are interesting sociological and psychological findings and studies that we've been discussing. So what's important here is culture and how culture is organized within a business engineering kind of corporate setting. So culture is largely set by the leaders. So there is a kind of psychological tendency to where there's a prestige bias where people tend to either consciously or subconsciously mimic as well as follow as well as look up to those who are in charge, to leaders. So culture is largely set by leaders. If profit at the sake of ethics, right, making decisions only to try to maximize profit, and it doesn't really matter about ethics, if that's the concern of the leaders, this will likely be the culture of the entire organization. And it will likely be the case that any kind of whistleblowing, raising the alarm, blowing the whistle when there's something unethical going on, that will be frowned upon. So it's important for setting the culture that managers and leaders are in large need to kind of lead by example. So that's very important. Here are some steps now, though, for creating a better culture. And there are a variety of steps and things that can be done. One is have a formal procedures for lodging complaints. You can also have an anonymous tip line, right, for those who might be afraid that there might be some repercussions or ramifications on their career if they blow the whistle. There should be in-house or even third-party ethics officers. So these ethics officers are called ombudsmen. And ombudsmen, they are responsible for listening to ethical complaints. Right? There could be something wrong with a product that could lead to a kind of unethical outcome. So they're responsible for listening to these complaints and making sure that something is done about it. A fourth thing is to promote critical loyalty rather than blind loyalty. So it's important to have loyalty in business, right? You want loyalty, but it shouldn't be blind loyalty where you have workers within a corporation who blindly will be loyal no matter what, even if it's creating a product that's harmful. But there should be critical loyalty, right? You want people who are loyal but also critical and will say something and try to get things changed if there's something wrong with a product or a project. Here are some more steps. One is to focus on issues rather than personalities to avoid personality clashes. So when there is a particular ethical issue that arises, it's important for those people who are involved in it to really, the kind of concepts and language and terms they use, they should not be kind of personal attacks on people's character or who they are, but it should be on the issue itself, the problem with the product, let's say, that can cause harm to others, right? Focus on the issues rather than personalities. That can be more constructive. It can avoid, and it can be a way to avoid personality clashes. Also, keep records of what was said, right? Keep records. It's very easy for us to forget things. So to keep records of complaints, of what was said, of what managers' responses to it, keep track of whether or not adequate steps were taken, things like that. So keep detailed records. Also, complaints should be confidential. So anytime complaints are made, it shouldn't be spread out throughout the entire, let's say, company that this person raised the alarm or blew the whistle about this particular issue, but it should be kept behind closed doors where only a few people know about it. Relevant people should only know about it. Also, third-party arbitrators should be used when relevant, right? When there might be ethical issues that arise, you can have it might be helpful to have someone outside of the company, a third-party arbitrator, come in to be the judge and to be the arbitrator and make a decision about the case or try to make a reconciliation on the issue. Also, a company should protect whistleblowers from retaliation. So there shouldn't be, for example, demotions because of whistleblowing, firings, or keeping someone from having promotions. So these are common things that happen for whistleblowers who raise the alarm. But rather, what should happen is that these whistleblowers should be protected. Also have a swift process of resolution. delaying resolutions can be a means of punishing dissenters. So try to have a quick arbitration procedure where complaints that have been filed, they get remedied and they get addressed very quickly. Having delays and letting things hang in the air, especially if other people in the company know about it and these other people are questioning the loyalty of this person who's blowing the whistle, and this is just lingering and hanging in the air, this can be to the detriment and a kind of punishment to dissenters and whistleblowers. All right, so these are a variety of steps that companies and engineers and possible future engineers also can help instill to create the right kind of culture. Okay, so next let's discuss managers and try to look at things from a manager's perspective. In engineering, there are lots of managers who do not have an engineering background, but in a lot of cases, there are also engineers who want to be managers and they become managers. This can come with more prestige and more pay and salary. So trying to look at things from a manager's perspective, through a manager's shoes or eyes, managers have other considerations, right? Part of their job description. They have other considerations to keep in mind that an engineer, let's say that's underneath the manager, may not. For example, managers have to be interested in things like keeping costs down to make sure our product is profitable. So we can now look at the issue of when engineers should make a decision. These are, in this case, engineers, I mean engineers who are not managers. When it's proper for an engineer to be making the decision, and issues when it's proper for a manager to be making the decision. So a decision, a proper engineering decision, a proper decision that engineers working in a company should make is a decision that should be made by engineers as it involves technical expertise. So decisions that require technical expertise should be made by engineers, or if it falls within the ethical standards of engineering codes. So if there's a decision that is relevant to the ethical codes of engineering, such as making sure you don't create a product that's has a significant risk of harming others or harming the environment or having effects on human life, broadly speaking, well, that falls within the ethical standards of an engineer's code. So engineers, in following the code and being virtuous engineers, they should be making these kinds of decisions and making sure they fall within the guidelines of these ethical standards and codes. For example, if there's a decision about which valve to use, where one valve is better and more efficient than another, and let's say safer than another, well, this kind of decision should be made by engineers as far as which valve to use. Now, some decisions that fall within properly the proper bounds of a manager and management decisions, these are decisions that should be made by the manager as it involves the well-being of the overall company. For example, taking into account things like cost, right? Making sure the company is profitable, having lower costs, and the company is profitable such that it stays afloat and engineers have jobs within this company. Things like scheduling for engineers, marketing the product, right? Making sure it's you take care of marketing so people actually buy the product and the company stays afloat, doing things that keep up employee morale. So these are kinds of relevant areas for management and management decisions. Proper management decisions are where it doesn't force engineers or other professionals to make unacceptable moral compromises. So management decisions should not go against engineers trying to follow ethical standards and guidelines. So that cannot be crossed. So engineers, so creating products that, for example, cross those standards or guidelines, a manager, for example, saying you have to design a product in this kind of way, even though it, let's say, might cause cancer or to others, or harm them or make people sick or what have you, that line cannot be crossed. There cannot be any unacceptable moral compromises in a manager's decision. So to give you an example of a decision that falls properly within the management bounds is, let's say you have two valves in which the engineers have determined they're both equally good. But one can be received quicker, or the people making this valve A rather than valve B, they have faster production lines and they can get you the valves faster, and it's cheaper. In this situation, this is a decision that properly falls within the bounds of management, and a manager should make this decision. So we shouldn't think of these distinctions of what's a proper decision that should go to the engineer and what's a proper decision that goes to the manager as being something that's a black and white issue where there's a kind of fine dividing line where we can, clearly divide up possible decisions and issues amongst engineers versus managers. Some cases might fall in a gray area between proper engineering and management decisions, in which case it really would be important for engineers and managers to work together and for both sides to get proper feedback from each other, from their different kinds of perspectives. All right, so with that, that's the last slide here, and I will see you for the next.